Well, as you might guess, I have some bad news. Brett Stevens, who is a resident of New York City, is unable to come due to some bad weather reporting, apparently. Not actually bad weather, but just bad weather forecasting. His flight was canceled, so he was unable to come. Fred Siegel has graciously agreed to speak this evening at 8 p.m., and the good news is that we have a treat here on stage with us. We felt so bad about Mr. Hewitt saying that we invited him in January that we asked him to stay another day so he could enjoy temperatures above 20 degrees with the sun out today. This front row is really good. They laugh at my jokes. He's going to interview Dr. Arnn on the importance of a free press. I need not introduce our dear president, Dr. Arnn, as you all know him, or if you don't, we'll soon know him, and Hugh Hewitt. I give them to you both right now. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you, Matt. Now, I'm glad to be back in my more natural environment, which is asking questions. This is what I like to do. Now, I do this weekly with President Arnn on the Hillsdale Dialogue, and I try and stump him each week, and he is from Arkansas and I'm from Ohio, so that's not very difficult. And so I promised on his home turf I would be easy on him. But first I learned from Kyle, with whom I have more correspondence than I do practically anyone in my family because of these weekly conversations with Dr. Arnn, Kyle Murnan over here. I asked him about the Biermann Center, and for the benefit of people watching at home who may not know about this place and who it is named for, I thought it might be appropriate if you told us that story because I was charmed by it.
Frank Biermann was married to a wonderful woman whose picture is over there, and she was what do we call them? We call them non-traditional student. That's to say she was in her late 40s maybe when she came, 30s when she came here, and she was on our track team. She was a tremendous runner, and she died of an illness a long time ago, and Frank grieves for her still, and Frank gave us most of the money for this building, and he's a really great man. You should meet him. He comes around here a lot, and the building is tremendously useful. It has the best, I think it's probably the best in the country, indoor track, because it's the first one built after new standards came in so that you have to have relaxed curves. That makes for a bigger building and faster indoor times without having to train more. Track people love that. And it's designed so that, like these things, these big murals, when you turn them over, those things are permanent. They state the meaning of the college. You should go read them. We try to remember that here. And these murals on this side, they all turn over, and there are sports themes on them. So we designed the building so we could cover up athletics and have commencement in here. It's a good place for that. We have some big screens that come down, and so now we have a nicer place to have commencement. And the third use of it, apart from athletics and commencement and ceremonies like this, is it's a big indoor playground. And you can see there's a lot of light in here, and so if the winter is really bad, and this is not a bad winter, Hugh is just a weenie, if it's really bad, then the students turn into vampires, and they stay up all night, and they get kind of sallow, and they grow fangs, and they get depressed and feel awful, and the pressure of everything overcomes them, and so the only solution we found is to bring them in here and make them sweat.
It's a wonderful building, and when you say non-traditional student, she wasn't like 25. She was a decade or more older than that, and she was on your cross-country team.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, she was good, too. She was very good.
I think that's terrific. Now, second question before I go to national security and press freedom. This one is, of course, very relevant to that. Do you think Secretary of State Clinton would be a less bad president than President Obama?
How could she not? I mean, you know, in statistics, they always say it's very deceptive if you have a bar graph and you don't start it at 0, because that exaggerates the difference. And so I think President Clinton will be significantly better than President Obama, and if you start the bar graph at 0, and he's here, she'll be like there. Yeah, I think there's a lot of dangerous things going on in the government now, and she might perpetuate them.
And dangerous things is to what we turn. In our nearly absolute free press that we enjoy, is that good for freedom over the long haul, or does history show us that restrictions from wartime are in fact necessary even in peacetime, because peacetime is no longer peacetime?
Well, I want to state a general premise to start, and then I'll agree with what I think is the trend of your question. The general thing I want to say is that I think that there are increasing controls on speech, and that they are advocated openly in the government. A Chicago law professor named Cass Sunstein, who was the regulatory czar in the first Obama term and permitted himself to be called that, frankly contends for such things. Tom West here and I have debated him about that in the past. And what they think is, and the McCain-Feingold regulation, law, campaign finance regulation, had the explicit purpose, and it was a bipartisan bill, McCain and Feingold, John McCain and the liberal senator now out of the Senate from Wisconsin. Its purpose was to stop people from being so critical of Congress within 90 days of an election. And so I think that's the trend, and I think all of the First Amendment freedoms, which are the central freedoms because they have to do with the specific human gift of reason and speech from which arises conscience and worship, are more heavily constrained as time goes on, and increasingly so. Now your question, I think that there are some constraints on speech, and I think that they're found in national security and in libel, harming the reputation of a person in writing, or slander, harming the reputation of a person in speech, and those are old, hallowed exceptions, and there are constraints on them, and there should be, there must be. So, you know, there have been enormous breaches of national security in recent years by people who took an oath not to do that, and those are wrong, but you have to have, and so there are judgments that come up because of that, and you have to have a political process that is constrained by a constitution and by representation of the people that puts a check on how much of that there can be, and there should be the utter minimum necessary.
The British have the Official Secrets Act, with which you are probably much more familiar than I am.
I'm a signatory to it.
Are you?
Oh yeah, I used to work in the Churchill archive, and you had to sign it.
So tell us about whether or not that's a good thing for free people, because earlier at lunch day you were saying Churchill explained why England is itself free. And so they have this much more draconian punishment of people who are breakers of that oath that you signed than we do. Our oath breakers end up forfeiting book royalties, Frank Snepp of the CIA, et cetera. Do you think they're better served by an Official Secrets Act than we are by none?
Yeah, theirs is not too bad, and remember the context. You don't have to work for the government. Even in America today and in Britain today, there are actually jobs that are not jobs inside the government. Hard to believe, though it is. And so if you're going to become privy to the government's secrets, and it must have some because it has enemies, and you sign this act, then you have taken a voluntary step, and you don't have to take it if you don't want to.
So that's part one. Part two is the libel law that you referred. Britain, again, where you labored for a lot of years, has a much more draconian libel law. It's much easier to be pulled into the dock. We have the New York Times v. Sullivan standard where it practically is impossible to libel you or me because we're public people. And so the standard is it was reckless disregard for the truth or knowing falsity with malice aforethought. The Brits have a much lower standard. What do you make of the relative systems?
Well, you're the lawyer here, not I, but as I understand it, what that doctrine or that law that you named says is that if it's a public figure that you say something bad about, you have to prove malice against the person.
Or knowing falsehood.
It's not just that it has to be true, because if you say something bad about me or I about you and it isn't true and it causes you harm, then that's a legal tort, and you're not supposed to do that to people. And recovery is possible, just like if you burn somebody's house down. Madison, I actually prepared a little for this in a shocking development. And Madison, I found him today writing that a danger to harm to your reputation is a more serious kind of harm than taking somebody's property. The property can be restored. So the English law doesn't have that exception, and that exception ought not to be, in my opinion, because if you harm somebody, they should be able to recover against you. And I found a place where Ben Franklin, by the way, you should all read this. If you do a Google for Founders Constitution, that's online at the University of Chicago Press's website, edition of a really great book by Kurland and Lerner that takes all the provisions of the Constitution, and you click on one of them. It was originally 6 big fat books, and it shows you usually 25 to 35 writings about the meaning of the clause.
I've never heard of this in my life.
Oh wow! It might be about the meaning of the clauses of the Constitution the best single thing there is about the.
I've been teaching constitutional law for 15 years. I've never heard of this.
By the way, you will love it.
I will love it.
And I can tell you, I have them on my iPad. There are 35 to 31, I think, about the First Amendment, about the speech clause of the First Amendment, just that part. And Ben Franklin said that you should have, if we were to weaken the libel laws, we would have to strengthen the law of the cudgel. And what that means is if somebody says something really bad about you and it's not true, you should knock them down.
That's what Pope Francis said last week about anyone who made an insult about his mother.
Yeah, and wasn't that a shame, his attitude about all that? So if you need, and see, once you liberalize the libel laws, by the way, there have been things said about me. The first rule of public rhetoric is don't repeat the charges against you. But there was a radio program in public radio somewhere in the United States about 2 years ago about me. And the list of things they said about me are astonishing and bear no relation to my opinions. And the facts that they stated about my life are entirely wrong. And they didn't bother ever to call me. I still, to this day, have not heard from them, nor replied, because why would I? But you see that, I could have
No, I live every day with this, and I know that the trade-off is, while people can say one public radio station compared to like every single day, and other people do deal with this every day, the ability to speak into the public sector without fear of someone suing me and causing me any kind of harm. Mark Stein has lived the other side of this, where this crazy lawsuit has been filed against him for his opinion on global warming. It has dogged him for 3 or 4 years. It ought to have been dismissed immediately. So I have a great affection for this, but I'm curious that you're suggesting the framers did not intend it to go this far.
And here's another thing, Steve, because things are very distorted now. It's very hard to recover. I believe, by the way, it is the single most useful exercise to recover the system of government we used to have. And in the system of government, we used to have lawsuits work differently. And by the way, they still work substantially that way in England. Because in England, you didn't have the right of discovery. You had to know the facts or find them out somehow on your own. You couldn't put somebody you sued to the expense of defending a lawsuit if it was frivolous. And then a second thing, in England, it's still possible to recover attorney's fees. And so the way that, and so Hugh is in a terrible conflict of interest here because he's a public figure and a journalist and makes part of his living from that, and he's a lawyer and makes part of his living from that. And those two changes are enormous full employment for lawyer provisions that are recent innovations in America alone, not in the rest of the English-speaking world. So if you lived in a world where, if you wanted to sue somebody for libel, first of all, you'd have what he said, and you could prove that it wasn't true, or you couldn't. And second of all, the one who loses the lawsuit pays the legal fees. And that is an inducement against frivolous lawsuits.
But I go back to the idea that if you weaken that, people will be less fulsome in their criticism of public officials. And at this moment, we don't want to weaken that at all. The fairness doctrine I was talking about last night kept public officials protected for a long time. McCain-Feingold was an attempt to protect public officials from criticism within 60 days of their election. That was struck down as unconstitutional. I'm sad that people are not more responsible because they're not better, but I'm also happy that I don't have to worry about frivolous lawsuits.
Well, there's some historical answer to that, too, because it is probably true, and there was a lawsuit about it that is one of the key pieces of evidence we have about this, that Thomas Jefferson hired a scandalous journalist by the name of James Callender while Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State, and it's not unlikely that he paid him with funds from the Department of State to write dirty articles in the Philadelphia newspaper about Alexander Hamilton. And there was, I mean, Alexander Hamilton was probably illegitimate, and we know that in part from James Callender. And the Sally Hemings story about Thomas Jefferson comes from stories in the press when he was alive and important in America. So those laws didn't stop one from, and remember, one of the things you have to believe if you're a scholar, and if you believe in the truth, and if you try to teach young people to seek it, though it's hard to find, especially about big things, you have to believe that the facts are what they are, and that if you've got an expeditious way to find out what they are, then justice is likely to be done. And then you would get, because this line between saying dirty stuff about people in politics and letting them run free.
And destroying Mark Stein's 5 years of peace of mind, because you said expeditious, which is not what our system is.
See, the problem with that lawsuit against Mark Stein, who's a tremendous man, and some kind of a genius is what that guy is. Yeah. The problem with that is not that it's been filed. The problem with it is it's so expensive to get to the end of it.
Yes.
And so and somebody rich or some collection of rich interests files a lawsuit against you, and then your punishment begins the minute it's filed, and it's not over till you're broke. That's what's wrong.
And your night's sleep are gone. So I've never ever recommended to a client that they sue anyone for libel, no matter how grievous the libel, because you can't win. Now I want to talk to you about your framers and their attitude towards treasonous speech. The Alien and Sedition Act is a feature of the early republic. What are your thoughts? Well, explain to people what the Alien and Sedition Act is and whether it's consistent with what you thought the framers thought they were doing in Philadelphia. What's the framers' key?
I didn't choose the title.
It's a good title, and people ought to read the framers' key.
It's pretty good. So, first of all, one of the fundamental fights in the early American Republic after the Constitution was over this 1798 law signed by John Adams that said that if you say certain things critical of the government or provoking sedition, then you could be fined and imprisoned. And that was a sort of an implementation of the British law of seditious libel. And so libel is saying a bad thing about a private individual that isn't true, and seditious libel is saying a bad thing about the government. And the English had the most liberal system in the world at the time, and what it established was two things that were wonderful developments on the laws that existed in most of the world before. And one was there couldn't be a prior restraint. That is to say, you couldn't make, there's a I found it today, there's a 1668 law in England that said that you couldn't publish anything about the government until you'd submitted it to the registry and had it approved. Censorship in advance. And so no prior restraint, you could publish what you want. And then second, if you're hauled up, truth is a legitimate defense. And so the Alien and Sedition Act kind of follows that line. And first of all, Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Party, a colleague of John Adams, opposed this thing. John Marshall, the great Federalist judge, allowed later that he wasn't in the Congress when it was passed, but that he would have opposed it, and if it came up again, he would oppose it again. But Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who were busy founding what became the Democratic Party, it was a very different thing back in those days. The parties changed so much, although they have long continuity in America, and the change in the Democratic Party is as radical as the change in the Republican Party, which used to be really intelligent. That's an easy joke, and there is a lot of intelligence in both political parties today, somewhat different principles. So they took out after that thing really hard, and the Virginia legislature published something written by James Madison called the Virginia Resolutions, and the Kentucky legislature published something written by...
Pick it up again.
And a one, and a two. Oh, Ted. Ted.
I think it's swallowed in your tie. No, it's just dead.
Thank you all for coming.
No.
What?
You could stand at the podium.
That's so bad.
No, it's not.
I shouldn't have to do that. Can you hear me from here? No. That's no better.
But you're a taller mute person.
I am exactly the
You're
height.
back.
I am exactly the height of Winston Churchill. So they took off after that thing, and the Kentucky and the Virginia resolutions, and they're different in important ways, because on constitutional subjects, James Madison, in my reading, is much smarter than Thomas Jefferson. But they both call for the states to interpose to stop this invasion of the fundamental freedoms of the country. And Madison, whose Virginia resolutions are very worth reading, and they're in Curlin and Lerner, and they're anywhere on the internet, and in our Constitution Reader, they make the case that the English law is not good enough, and that you should write what you want about the government, and within the law, with the constraints of the law of libel, you can write it. And you can criticize people in office, and you can say they're disreputable. And there's, by the way, there's all kinds of things you can say about a person that are hard to prove that they're not true. And those things, by the way, tend to be discounted by the hearer, and that means that under a law where the libel laws ran, you could calumniate people all you wanted to if you just did it carefully, but it's when you get specific and you say they did this bad thing and that bad thing, and those are the things that carry more conviction. So there was a split over the Alien and Sedition Acts. They were passed only to run for 2 Congresses, that is to say for 4 years. And they expired, and one part of them, I'm told, did not expire and is still on the books, and I wish I could remember what part that is, but I don't.
So let me follow up. So you were, along with the framers, is it working now? New handheld, okay. I take it from your remarks that you agree with Jefferson in opposition to the Alien and Sedition Act. Madison. And as a result, it's okay to libel the government. It's okay to injure the government.
No.
Via speech.
The law of, first of all, disclosing secrets harmful to
You anticipate where I'm going.
Yeah. That is not legal, was not legal in that system.
But they're not secret after, this is the nub of it. Snowden is a traitorous, treasonous criminal. Snowden gives his secret material to someone who has not signed the oath, the New York Times. New York Times publishes the traitorous, treasonous material. They're not publishing a secret about which they have been obliged that they've signed an oath. So ought they to be punished, the New York Times, for publishing it?
Under the law, they can be, and I even favor that law. But one of the reasons I favor it is because it's very hard to do, and it always has been. And Snowden, it looks to me like, is in an unambiguous situation.
Yes.
And the people who then republish it
They're in the ambiguous
are in an
situation.
ambiguous situation. And my opinion is they ought not to do that. And you know, the way that has worked in some classic instances in American history is that, you know, I'm Abraham Lincoln, and somebody's got some information that would harm the war effort. Don't use that one, that's the Civil War. I'm Franklin Roosevelt, and somebody's got some information. And I really lack the power in advance from stopping them from doing anything. And so there have been in the past conversations where somebody powerful in the government sat down with somebody powerful in a media outlet, and they had a grown-up conversation, and they encouraged the person in the media outlet to make a mature judgment about it, and many times they have.
And many times they haven't.
Many times they haven't. And you know, once it gets there, by the way, that's a problem, right? Because the government is going to a person who has the right of freedom of speech and suppressing them. And in my opinion, there are conditions where they could rightly do that, but you don't like that, and you don't want it to happen often. And so often it's just better to suffer the harm in general, and I can show you where James Madison writes that.
That's curious. Tell us about what he thought. It was better to suffer the harm.
What he thought was that, and Jefferson too thought this, they wrote exactly the same about this. They thought that, you know, in the end they believed this. They believed that the granting and protection of freedom by a government is its greatest source of respect. And so claims against it are a sign of that freedom, and they reinforce it at the same time as they criticize it. And that a government that says that you can't do that is one that leads to rebellion. And so they thought that it was better, almost always, to let people say what they want.
Now, there are two specific instances in the last 12 years. Snowden is one. The other is a publication by the New York Times of the money following technology of America that the managing editor of the Washington Bureau of the Los Angeles Times had admitted to me on air probably had the effect of alerting terrorists that we were close to getting them. Probably allowed terrorists to escape, to continue their rampage and kill people. So we have Snowden, who did us billions of dollars worth of damage, hundreds of billions of dollars of damage, and we have the Los Angeles Times facilitating the escape of terrorists. In either of those cases, would you have counseled the government to prosecute them?
Well, I'd have to know the facts. As I said before, Snowden should be prosecuted.
I'm talking about the papers.
But the papers. The answer is I'd be very reluctant to do that, and I might. But the other thing about it is, by the way, it's so easy to publish now. And I judge these things partly, you know, in my maturity differently than I might have 30 years ago, because what I think is going on is, I mean, last night I sent in the final edits to my book on Winston Churchill, so Penny and I were drinking champagne. It's not because the book is good, it's because it's done. I discovered something yesterday and put it together. I'd read it before, but it came to me yesterday, and I added something. Churchill understood that we are getting the power through science to re-engineer the actual physical human being, to make them in factories, to limit their capacity. If you read Brave New World, which was published in the 20s, and for all I know Churchill read it, but in an essay called 50 Years Hence, he said, that's becoming a possibility. And what if we become manufactured objects? How will we be viewed by a powerful government and other powerful sources in the society? And so I judge that the comprehensiveness of government today is a problem. And so I'm looking for ways, and by the way, you don't have to look far, because ours is the best government in human history to do the two things we're talking about, which is to delegate and assemble power, because you need a lot of it in this world especially, and more as time goes on, and to limit the use of that power. And so things that touch on the place where those two needs come together, that's where the Constitution operates, and I'm inclined to judge in favor of restraint, wherever possible.
Can the president, as he did with al-Awlaki, send a drone to kill an American on foreign soil who's beyond the capture of the law, but who poses an immediate threat? Do you dispute his power to do that, by the way?
No.
Neither do I. I think it's perfectly appropriate for him to have done that, and I've argued that. Could the president do the same thing? If we can stop al-Awlaki from injuring Americans, why can't they stop journalists from publishing that which will injure Americans?
Well, the answer to that is obvious. And I'm saying that there are some cases, I imagine, where they could, but the answer is obvious. The purpose of the government, and therefore the purpose of the war, is to protect the right that's being interfered with. So I can show you in the Second World War, for example, where in both world wars, where Winston Churchill talks about things that they're doing in the war that have to stop the second the war is over. And I can show you fighting, so I'll name two more things. I can show you the second the war is over, him making motions to get those things stopped. And the third, in 1936, Winston Churchill wrote a essay called What Good's a Constitution? And it published it in 35 in Britain and in 36 in the United States. And that's during the court packing fight, right? Because the Supreme Court of the United States struck down the New Deal. And Churchill takes the side of the court. And he says, this argument that an economic crisis could be a parallel to a war, and remember, we just passed the 50th anniversary of the war on poverty. And poverty in those regions and everywhere that war has been waged is the same or worse than it was. And we spent enough money on it to make everybody in a condition of poverty rich through endowment. That is to say, set aside a bunch of money and just pay it to them every year. And Churchill says that if you build the conditions of war as an ongoing thing, the danger is you'll destroy the liberal nature of the society, where we all need room to move and live our own lives. And so he was very against that kind of thing. And this war on terror, which goes on and on and on, and may go on, by the way, in perpetuity, until it eats us, because I don't see how we're going to beat it, that means that we need principles of constraint that will protect the liberal nature of the society. And we need to be working on those hard.
To the issue of surveillance of our citizenry who might be involved in subversive activities, we've been around this block a few times, in the 50s and in the 20s. What do you think of the current balances struck? Snowden, if nothing else, illumined the extent of the apparatus. We have the guarantee, and I trust it, that we are not being, you and I are being observed because we're on circuit television to the world, anyone who wants to. So we have no expectation of privacy. But what do you think about the expectation of privacy in the national security state?
Well, I think the principles are easy to understand. First of all, information about you belongs to you unless you give it away. And there's a lot of, in the internet, right? Like, I signed up for something with Verizon the other day, and I did it on the phone, and 3 minutes later I went on the internet to open my account, and it asked me a series of questions. Which addresses have I lived at in the last 20 years? Where have I been employed in the last 20 years? I didn't give them any of that. You know, how do they know? The answer is everything is known, right?
Yes.
Let me just make a public statement that I didn't do it. And so So I worry about that stuff a lot. And I think that laws could be written, like the FBI is protesting against the encryption of data on phones, and I'm in favor of that. I think the FBI is wrong. So the first thing is, information about you is yours unless you give it away.
Those rules don't apply in wartime, do they? Did they apply in Great Britain during wartime? Did Churchill surveil British citizens?
Yeah, he did, and he didn't like it.
But he did it.
And he talked about the constraints on it. And remember, Churchill believed in this very much. Churchill had to go and make a case in front of a parliament that had the power to remove him any day and ask all kinds of awkward questions about it. And it's now known that, well, first of all, he would sometimes say, I can't talk about this, and so every once in a while they had a secret session. And those things are all available now. You can go read the secret session debates of the House of Commons during the Second World War, and very often he describes in there in detail what's going on and what the restraints on it are. So now, when you get into government, so you and I know some people in Congress, and some of them are lawyers, and we tend to have confidence in the same ones, and I can tell you that I press them on this a lot, and they tell me that there are, in fact, checks and balances on this snooping in the form of independent judges.
The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, to which I clerked 1 year.
Yeah.
That's what I was referring to earlier.
And it looks to me like you need that thing, and I hope it's strong. And people who know a lot about it tell me that it is, and I'm asking you now, is it?
Yes, it is. It was I have to qualify, it was in the Reagan administration first term when I was the assistant to the Attorney General for that court. However, two of the people that we have friends in common on the radio and you in person are Senator Tom Cotton and Congressman Mike Pompeo. They are both members of the House and the Senate Intelligence Committee, respectively. I've talked with them on the air about this. This is nothing. They won't tell you anything that goes on there, but they are the oversight branch. They're members of the oversight branch. You're close to both of them. Do you think the government tells them everything? Because that's the key question.
I think it should. And whether it does or not, I can tell you, because they've said it on the radio, they don't express big anxiety about that to me. They think they can find out what they need to know. And I hope so, because remember the structure, see? And here's what I think. I think that James Madison was correct. Name the assertion, and I can't think of one right now where I wouldn't say he was correct. But what he said was, men are not angels. And angels do not govern men, and so you have to have these controls. And he states what they are. I'll tell you what they are. It's easy to list them. The first check is that the people of the United States elect their government, except, by the way, very large part of it, of course, is not elected anymore and hard to control. It's most of it. Second, the people themselves, who are also people, and Lord knows what they might do, they don't do anything. They just work through representatives, so all of us have to wait till election time, right? And that's a check on us. And third, we delegate our authority to different branches and different levels of government. And Madison says that and fourth, there are independent courts that are not accountable in the immediate sense to anything except honesty and impeachable offenses. So those four things make a structure, and James Madison said that is the nature of the thing. That is the importance of the Constitution, to understand that structure. It's more important than the Bill of Rights. It's more important than any provision in it. And so I do not want to waive that structure.
There are two critiques out there. On one end, Glenn Greenwald, a radical journalist of apparently no limits in what he will reveal about the government. Senator Rand Paul, a friend of the Republican and doing great work. And they range from overt accusations of sinister action to the implication of at least negligent sinister action between Glenn Greenwald and Rand Paul. Do you believe them to have merit? And if so, how do you correct it within Madison's structure?
Well, again, that's like this thing about the law of libel and the way lawsuits work today. I'm in favor of big changes, and I don't expect to wake up in the morning and have them made, but, understand them and explain them. That's what's possible to do right now. That's why it's a good idea to be working in a place that's a learned institution, one of the reasons. So what you need is, first of all, look at the structure. The worst abuses that I know of have to do with the Internal Revenue Service, right? Mm-hmm. And that's recent, but also in the Nixon administration. Mm-hmm. And you just don't want the government being able to do that to you, right? And that's not good. And if you look at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution of the United States, it delegates the authorities to Congress, and about half of them have to do with national security. And forever and ever and ever, for 150 years, that was much the most of the government of the United States. And now it's, 20%, something like that, 30 maybe, I don't think it's 30. And so you've just got a lot going on a massive scale that has to do with the regulation of us. And it's a force unto itself, and let me mention, when Tocqueville comes to the United States in 1830s, he notices how much government there is, more than in France, right? Huge amount. But its character is local and voluntary. I'm for a lot of government. At the central level, I'm for a supreme government that deals with things that are listed in Article 1, Section 8 with the weight of what it does. And then I think, the government of Hillsdale, Michigan ought to have a lot more scope and authority over our local lives than it does. And it used to have, there are people alive today who saw that. And so I'm for that kind of reform. And when you argue about constitutionalism today, it's very important to sort of make a big picture of how the whole thing operated, of how it operates now, and the reasons behind the change. And then you can think about reform.
My approach with my law students, and I'll see if you think this is all wet, and if it is, I'll abandon it. When the government was 100 total, 1% malignancy rate was one bad actor, one Aaron Burr. When the government is 1 million strong, a 1% error rate is 10,000 malignant actors spread out across a variety of agencies doing Lois Lerner-like things from a variety of places. Our problem is not the structure. Our problem is the good or how we hire into that. I think that's our problem. That's what Rand Paul wants to overcorrect, I think. Sometimes he doesn't recognize 99% of the people who work in the government are patriots.
Sure.
And then that 1%, though, has grown so large by virtue of the expansion of the government. The only way actually to solve that problem is to shrink the government and to remove tenure. And Angleton spent his life going crazy trying to find moles. Did Churchill worry much about his moles? He came in after Philby was exposed or before Philby was.
Yeah, that was going on then. But remember, those moles, so Churchill worried very much about communism, right? Churchill, you may be surprised to learn, was an anti-communist. And he was eloquent and persistent anti-communist. He said that the Bolshevik society, which he said is an extreme form of things that are present in our societies, he said that it has no principle that has not been conceived, implemented for millennia in the society of the white ant. It's one of several places where Churchill said that under principles that are prevailing in the modern world, we come to look like insects. So I'm just establishing his credentials. And in 1939, the Soviet Union made an alliance with Nazi Germany, and that broke up in 1941 when Hitler invaded his ally. Hitler, you may be surprised to learn, was not always honest in his dealings. And so on that day, the Daily Worker in Britain and the communist movement in Britain immediately reversed its tune and became pro-war. And so whatever Blunt and Philby and McLean might have been doing in 1939 to 1941, they stopped doing it in 1941. And then they were busy again after the Fulton speech when Churchill sort of acknowledged the existence of the Cold War.
Now I'm going to go to questions in the audience on this because I'm sure we have some in the Rand Paul world and some who are not in the Rand Paul world of suspicion, but I have one quick question before we do, and I have to leave at 5 and then you can continue asking questions. Today is the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz by the communists, 70 years ago today. What was Churchill's reaction to the expose of the camps?
Well, that particular thing was not the expose.
Right.
The news had been coming. It may surprise you to know Churchill was also an anti-Nazi, and he knew what they were from 1933. But when the world came to see that they had built factories to kill people and process them, it's also true, so I used to work for Sir Martin Gilbert, and he's a great man, and one of the things he has done is write a bunch of books on the Holocaust. And there are lots of memos, massive evidence of arguments between the Gestapo and the Wehrmacht, the German military, about priority of transport. Because the Gestapo wanted to ship Jews and the military wanted to ship ammunition and soldiers and food and supplies. And the Gestapo often won those arguments, right? It was a high priority. And it began to be understood when those what popularly understood, 3 guys escaped from Auschwitz, and they ended up in Israel, interviewed, if memory serves, by a man named Moshe Shertok. I can show you in Martin Gilbert's books where these are. And they described this death camp. And he interviewed them for weeks because he couldn't believe it.
Who could?
Who could?
Who could?
And there's a man named Chaim Weizmann who's one of the founders of modern Israel, and he was a chemist. And in the First World War, he played the largest part in inventing an alternative to cordite, which made explosive shells go up. And the Allies were running out of it. And when Churchill, at the end of the First World War, was Minister of Munitions, and he and Weizmann became big buddies. And Weizmann comes into Churchill's office after this report comes to him now, after they believed it from Jerusalem about this camp. And Weizmann could come see Winston Churchill when he wanted to. And he gives him a list, and the list is published in one of Martin Gilbert's books. And one of the items on the list is, I think it might have been first, but I'd have to go look and be sure. Martin Gilbert always said, one of his advices, I give it to all the students here, is, you have an excellent memory, and I have an excellent memory, and we do not rely upon our memories. So with him, you always have to go look it up. But I think it might have been first in the list to parachute somebody and look at this thing and see if this thing can be true. And, that this is the Churchill who had written in the 30s that where things are going is that we may become manufactured items with all of the dignity and respect pertaining thereto. And now it's there. And he knew that in Hitler early. You should read his speeches in the 30s. They're tremendous, explaining what this thing means. And remember, Churchill's argument all his life was that these extreme ideologies are only extreme forms of doctrines that are present among us. And
when Eisenhower liberated the furthest west camp, his troops brought him and he toured it, and he came back and he marched the German mayor and his wife through the town, and they repaired to their homes and they hung themselves. Eisenhower was so shocked. So obviously the Allied armies did not have detailed knowledge of these camps. No. So did Churchill record any reaction?
Of course, yeah.
What was it?
Well, you have to remember, by the way, that the knowledge came out over time But Churchill understood the point in principle
From a long time ago.
early. And so the horror of the thing, because you know, once it's present in front of you, it's different, and he spoke about that.
I'd love to read that today. Now, we have 10 minutes before I have to turn into a pumpkin. You can keep asking. We have first here and then up front.
Thank you, Mr. Hewitt and Dr. Arnn. I would like to contest your point last night about no one here under 50 having seen William Buckley's firing line. After attending the Koch internship program last summer, our speech coach suggested that there was no one better to learn speech from than Mr. Buckley. I have seen experts of 3 episodes of Mr. Buckley's firing line. Mr. Hewitt, your interview style reminds me of Mr. Buckley slightly. And Dr. Arnn, I suppose you most remind me of your style of answering questions, a bit of Ron Paul in the 1970s. Mr. Hewitt, I would like to disagree that Snowden is a traitor because he's appealing to a higher law than government, which is natural law. Would Americans be as rightly alarmed as they are right now about privacy rights if Mr. Snowden had not spoken his conscience?
It is an excellent question. It's the question. I'm going to defer to your president to answer that question. Because my question is on the radio. I answer that over and over again, perhaps too abruptly, but he's your student.
Is he?
I don't know. Are you? He said no debate coach, so he gave a poker tell.
So every human being has the right of revolution. But the people who first propounded that right, the philosophers and the statesmen, also understood that that has to be used with great caution. And the reason it has to be is because we must live under law. We are made for it. It is written in our nature. And one of my favorite things to say, because it's kind of a joke, is the form of government least workable is anarchy. And so to take the step of rebelling against your country is a very big step. That's why the Declaration of Independence is written in the way that it is. And I haven't heard anything from Mr. Snowden, a patch as eloquent as that. And I think we would be concerned about privacy rights without him. So I'm not yet ready to style him Thomas Jefferson.
My answer is much more blunt. Of course he's a traitor, or the word traitor does not have any meaning. So if you can come up with a definition of traitor into which he does not fit, I'll entertain the conversation. But if our framers had acted like Snowden, they would have signed the Declaration of Independence and repaired immediately to continental France, which I might add is what Jefferson did.
So, by the way, remember Thomas Jefferson was a traitor. And at the moment he wrote and the others signed the Declaration of Independence, there was a writ out for their arrest to an army. And you just have to see the terms of the Declaration of Independence because it's the most brilliant, beautiful, revolutionary document ever written, in my opinion. And its case is this: the king has manifested and is practically implementing the principle that he can rule us however he pleases and without our consent. And so I don't believe that that case is makeable today against the American government, and I pray that it doesn't come to be, and I'm afraid about that kind of thing. So I wouldn't make that judgment the way he did, but also I don't think that the people who proclaim him a hero, they don't quite understand how bad that thing is to do if you do it, because that's hell. You know, the American Revolution was not an easy experience, and it went about as well as one can go.
And there are Americans dead because of Snowden. The Crimea is probably taken because of Snowden back into the darkness. Snowden, if there is an eternal court sitting, is going to have a very long trial and won't like the consequence. But well put.
Yeah.
Thank you both very much for doing this. Mr. Hewitt, last week you had an interview with Senator Tom Cotton of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and obviously he has information that's very sensitive. Now, as a journalist, you're pursuing the truth, and obviously he has this kind of information that, if it were to come out, would be harmful to our country. So as a journalist, when you're pursuing the truth in that kind of interview, how do you prepare to ask these kind of questions without also making him release information or seeming like he's withholding information?
Dom, that's a great question, and I do it normally by letting the audience know beforehand that I understand my guests to be bound by the oaths that Dr. Arnn referred to. I still have some of them in place from 1984, which I took regarding information I saw, which probably wouldn't interest even a historian anymore. But I remember the oaths, and I remember what I can't talk about. So I always say, I'm aware, and of course you're not going to answer anything that would constrain, but to the extent of your ability, will you tell us? And it has typically been the case with Congressman Pompeo and Senator Cotton that they will always say, and I don't think I can say any more than that, because they have training, they have staff, they have intelligence professionals that advise them. But one of the most difficult things, and I'll close here, I'll leave you to tell this story, because I thought it's so fascinating at lunch. What you say can give away bookshelves. One line can give away bookshelves. And if you haven't seen The Imitation Game, the end of it is, what do you do with intelligence? And I think Dr. Arnn has to write a new chapter in his book about how Churchill handled intelligence. But tell them about Enigma and the invasion as I leave you to go to the interview at 5:15, because I think that'll talk about the difficulty of the subject that we're dealing with here. Thank you very much, friends. I have to go do radio.
So I'll tell you, do you want to know about Enigma? Well, the Germans, which were, the Prussians are older and the German states are older, but it came to be a country in 1866. Thank you, Richard Reeb, who's going to get to ask a question before we go. They were very formidable in war, and they were also very German in war. That is, they were very systematic. And in the Second World War, they had a machine, an encoding machine, and they distributed it around, and they took German care in preventing it from being seized, and then they changed the codes all the time, and they were very complex, and it was very hard to decode the codes, and then you had to put them into this machine after you got that part right. And the Allies got their hands on a machine, one of the machines, and then a lot of very brilliant people figured out how to use it. And then they had to break the codes. All this took a long time. And it happened in Bletchley Park outside London, and that little place, a little village. The next thing you know, there's 20,000 people working out there. And nobody knew what they were doing. And they were going down the village road. And they kept the secret very well. And the man in charge of it was only referred to in correspondence as C. And the number of people who knew what it was outside Bletchley Park, and the people in Bletchley Park largely didn't know what they were doing, that is to say the whole picture about the machine and all. And the number of people in the British government who knew was not as numerous as the cabinet. And Churchill himself read the decrypts every day, and they knew in detail, in say any time from middle of 1943 on, they knew in detail most of what Germany was up to in the war. And they ran them out of South Africa faster because of that. And much of their success and the rapidity with which it happened had to do with this thing. And they were very careful about how they used it.
We have time for one more question.
Well, mine works. I think on the libel question, which I almost hesitate to return to after all that interesting discussion, but I think Alexander Hamilton had the last word on that. As the lawyer in the appeal of People versus Croswell in New York in 1802 and 1803, he framed the principle of libel law, which prevailed until New York Times versus Sullivan, which is to say the truth is a defense as long as it's done for good ends and without malice. Okay, and so I think that that whole era of libel law should be at least recalled, because the price we paid for New York Times versus Sullivan has been the assassination of a lot of public careers, reputations. Do you agree with it? I suppose you agree.
I just heard it. So I don't know what I did to Ted, but I'm either going to undo it or do more. I don't know which. But yeah, so that's right. And see, the situation is distorted. Imagine a society in which people are treated before the law equally and is responsible for their actions. That's what you want. So if somebody causes harm, there's a way to recover. And that way to recover doesn't encourage spurious attempts to shut people up, because you have to pay the legal bills for both if you do that. And trials are expeditious. And you go with the facts that are available to you. You don't get to fish around in somebody's stuff. And so in that world, it locates responsibility in general, by the way. The thing about life in general, the thing about management, the thing about education, about teaching, the thing about government is you want to locate responsibility and authority together. And that way people can all act, and they will be improved by living an existence where those two things are together. So, you know, I think Party X is a dirty dog. Well, you know, I might be hesitant to call him that because, as a matter of fact, I don't really know whether he's dirty, and he surely is not a dog. But I'll take the trouble to think up what I really think and something I can defend. And this way of doing it is, everybody is a target, and then the next thing you know, we're passing comprehensive laws to regulate who can say what in politics as an alternative to that old system of justice which was developed for a long time and I dare say perfected in our country. Thank you.